Today we cancel someone named Hunter Avallone. He's apparently a YouTuber and Twitch streamer with a moderately large following, though I'd never heard of him. It came to my...
Okay, well, that's hurtful.
Okay, it's not how you win an argument. You don't just go to Google, studies that confirm what I already believed. Oh, here's one, see?
They always do this. It's one of the biggest copes, actually. Oh, well, you just Googled a study that agreed with you. Okay, Matt, if everybody can just Google a study to agree with them, where's your study, pal? Where is it? Surely you're gonna flash it up on screen for me, right?
Puberty blockers are different because they are a life-saving medical intervention, he claimed. He also noted that I am an ape and I should go F myself.
Oh man, that's rich, dude. Holy shit, he's trying so hard. Listen to how mean this soy boy was to me on Twitter.
Higher rate of suicide was due to, quote, social issues, not the transition, because what, you somehow know why all these people killed themselves? Well, I mean, well, you made it up, of course. And whatever the...
Oh no. Didn't he just accuse me of sending him evidence that I didn't read, or sending him studies that I actually didn't read? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, non-binaries and theys and thems, it is true. The rumors are confirmed. Known subhuman Matt Walsh has called me out. He actually did an entire video about me because apparently I'm just that interesting. So let me give you a little bit of background about what happened, what instigated this feud, and then I will, of course, go through the video that Walsh did on me. So this all began the other day when someone who seems to be missing a brain. This is a tweet by Addison Smith with OAN, so One America News Network. So that's a little bit embarrassing. As we all know, the resume process for applying for a job at OANN is literally to get a MRI scan, and as long as it comes back as negative, there's no detection of a brain, you're as good as hired. So this guy tweets out, after spending half an hour trying to make Matt Walsh look like the villain, Hunter says children can consent. Giving kids puberty blockers after they've consented, that's actually a good thing. So let's go ahead and watch this clip and see if what I've said here has officially exposed me.
Adolescent children. As far as surgeries, double...
Wait, giving kids the puberty blockers after they've been confirmed gender dysphoric, and they've consented, and their therapists have consented, and their doctors have consented, and their parents have consented, and they've been persistent in gender dysphoria for a minimum of 6 months. Yeah, that's actually a good thing, Matt. I know you think that by lying to
adolescent children.
So apparently this is me saying kids can consent. I guess I need to break this down for some of these special individuals, but there is such a thing as medical consent. Children by themselves cannot consent. They cannot consent in terms of medical procedures either. However, that's why the parents' consent is so relevant here. This is how any medical procedure works. This is how it works. If my 3-year-old needs to get tubes in her ears, she might consent, but it's really ultimately the parents who are going to consent. Am I violating my child by getting them medical treatment? No, because children can obviously consent to a degree in specific contexts when we are talking about medical consent. Keep in mind that if we were going to ignore this, then little Timmy at the age of 6 years old, having a cancerous tumor in his stomach, if we were to cut him open and remove that tumor, that would be grooming and rape, according to these conservative nimwits. So no, I never said that kids can consent, as in kids can consent to anything, anytime, LOL. I said that in specific contexts, as far as medical treatment goes, kids potentially have the ability to consent, along with the consent of doctors, therapists, and most importantly, their parents, because we recognize that parents tend to have the best interests of their children in mind. This is so painfully obvious. Is every time a child receives some kind of medical treatment a violation of that child? Does that mean every doctor who has ever given a shot to a little kid who's screaming and crying and saying they really don't want to get a shot is actually like a pedophile rapist? No, of course not. This is ridiculous. And before anybody jumps in here, because people on Twitter were already saying, do you think then that kids can consent to getting tattoos and drink alcohol? Again, no. drinking alcohol, getting tattoos. This is not potentially life-saving medical attention. We should obviously avoid giving kids the ability to make massive decisions regarding their lives as much as possible. But of course, if we are talking about medical treatment and we're talking about a child who is suffering severely from gender dysphoria, something has to be done. So in summary, no, I never said kids can consent, as in kids can consent to anything, anytime. That has never been my argument. And two, obviously parental consent and kids' consent is relevant when we're talking about medical treatment. Matt Walsh jumps in and responds to good old me, good old yours truly. A child is able to consent to permanent life-altering decisions to include sterilization and the removal of healthy body parts as long as adults consent too. How does that work? In what way does the adult's consent magically validate the child's consent? Please elaborate. So I don't want to instantly accuse Matt of being bad faith here, but I think he's being intentionally obtuse. How does the parents' consent matter? Because when you're talking about kids undergoing medical treatment, the parents' consent is incredibly important. Because again, we generally recognize parents have their child's best interests in mind. Of course, this doesn't go for every parent, but generally this is the standard in which we try to adhere to. So one, I was talking about puberty blockers, which are not permanent so long as you are on them for under 2 years. I don't believe that includes sterilization, and it certainly does not include removing healthy body parts, because even the Endocrine Society has said that genital reassignment surgery is not even recommended under the age of 18. So we're only talking about puberty blockers here. So how does the adult's consent matter? Because that's how the medical field operates. Because a child coming in and saying, I'm depressed, can I have meds? Isn't the same as a child saying, I'm suffering from depression, and then a parent stepping up and saying, I raise my kid, and yes, they are suffering from depression every day. I respond, firstly, we're talking about puberty blockers, not removing any body parts. Puberty blockers are largely reversible. I was absolutely crucified for this statement right here, but don't worry, I'll get into the data in a moment. Secondly, medical consent is unique. Medical intervention can be life-saving. A child consenting to sex or alcohol is not. Anytime a child has any medical procedure, the parents must also consent. That's why the minor's ability to consent is largely based on parental consent as well. Lastly, if they can't consent, why did you say 16-year-olds can consent to marriage and child rearing? Go fuck yourself, you ape. Of course, I always like to throw a little bit of insults when I am on Twitter. That's what Twitter's for. Throwing some fun old insults. Now, of course, I'm going to be quite calm in my response here, but I responded to Matt, took him a little while, then he responded again. So you don't support cross-sex hormones or double mastectomies for minors then? Or do you, or you do, but you don't want to defend it? My position has always been that any time you're going to undergo surgery, like a double mastectomy, it is definitely ideal to wait until you're the age of 18. Absolutely. Then he says, also, puberty blockers are chemical castration drugs and have been used for that purpose on sex offenders. Your position is that the chemical castration of a child is life-saving. You have zero evidence to support this batshit insane claim because no such evidence exists. Another question, prior to the invention of the puberty blocker, how many children died from not having access to it? Please give me at least a rough estimate. So he's invoked this argument multiple times, like, where were all the kids killing themselves prior to puberty blockers? You know that, like, trans people are a very small minority. Trans youth are a minority of a minority. And then trans youth who actually get puberty blockers are a minority of a minority of a minority. We're not going to see, like, some excess suicide here. We're talking about a very small minority. They're only at a higher risk of suicide per capita. We wouldn't see this just in raw data. He then goes on to talk about how puberty blockers are chemical castration drugs. Now, this is true, okay? It's true, yes. Puberty blockers can also be given in much higher dosages to invoke chemical castration on sex offenders, yeah. But guess what? Too much Tylenol can kill you. They're not the death pills. It's that we recognize that when we're talking about medicine, dosages matter. I know, mind fucking blown. Turns out that if you do nothing but drink water all day, every day, you might die. But water is not the death liquid. Too much of anything can have a negative effect. The proper dosage can have therapeutic effects. Obviously, this is like saying, did you know that some people can take 200 milligrams of Adderall in one day and then have heart attacks? Okay, well, some people can take 10 milligrams of Adderall and have therapeutic benefits. I guess I have to really spell this out very, very simply, but medicine can be good too much of that medicine can be bad. Everybody following thus far? It's not that complicated. Matt Walsh is being disingenuous. I responded the same thing that I just said now. Firstly, too much Tylenol can kill you. They aren't death pills. Puberty blockers can be detrimental if given in large doses, but beneficial when given in proper doses. Why is this so hard for your chimp brain to grasp? Medicine can be good. Too much medicine can be bad. Secondly, I think permanent surgery should be held off on until 18, ideally. So that was my response. And then he responds something even more insane. So a small amount of chemical castration can be beneficial for a child? No, because the small amount of puberty blockers is not chemical castration. He's like assuming that puberty blockers are still chemical castration and then lumping it in. This is fallacious argumentation right here. No, a small amount of chemical castration is not beneficial. A proper dose of puberty blockers can be beneficial. A small dose of puberty blockers does not amount to chemical castration. You are lying right now, Matt. And then he says, and you haven't answered my questions. What about cross-sex hormones, which sterilize the child? The same medical establishment you trust implicitly on puberty blockers also recommends sterilization as a life-saving procedure. And again, where's your evidence that puberty blockers save lives? I said, okay, he's definitely being bad faith. Smaller doses of puberty blockers are not chemical castration. I'm fine with puberty blockers for minors. Surgery and hormones shouldn't be given unless 18 years or older. Go back to being the creepy dude hanging outside the high school, you degenerate scum. Very cute, I know. Finally, he says one more thing. Last attempt. What is your evidence that puberty blockers save lives? Can you give me examples of children who died from a lack of access? And why do you doubt the medical establishment's recommendations on hormones and surgeries while trusting them on blockers? And I said, sure, I've attached some evidence below since you're too retarded to read yourself. Firstly, here's a cohort of trans people over 40 plus years showing that no increase of suicide was present after transition. Although the suicide risk remained higher, this was due to social issues, not transition. Secondly, here's a study which found that puberty suppression and affirmation care was correlated with a 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts. From JAMA Network, mental health outcomes in transgender and non-binary youths receiving gender-affirming care. The study found that access to gender-affirming care was associated with mitigation of mental health disparities among TNB, transgender and non-binary youths, over 1 year. So he asked for evidence that it was life-saving. I give him evidence. It was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality over a 12-month follow-up. Now we are on to the actual video. Because Matt never responded to my tweet here. Instead, he decided to make an entire video about yours truly. So we go over to the good old Matt Walsh channel where a random YouTuber tried to debate me. That's me, guys. See, there's my picture there. Hey, I'm the random YouTuber. Haha, yay. All right, Matt, I am ready to hear your beautiful, godlike intellectual arguments. Please take it away, buddy.
Today we cancel someone named Hunter Avallone. He's apparently a YouTuber and Twitch streamer with a moderately large following, though I'd never heard of him. It came to my
Okay, well, that's hurtful.
attention thanks to a clip posted to Twitter by Addison Smith of OAN. And what came to my attention is that Hunter posted a lengthy video to his YouTube channel reacting to my testimony in front of the Tennessee House Committee about their now passed legislation banning child gender transitions. Hunter is apparently a big fan of child castration. He's a fierce advocate of castrating children. And so, as we'll see,
this is actually very true. It's incredibly true. What I do is I'll go down to like the local playground and I'll bring my steak knife and I'll just try to castrate any kid that walks past me. Okay. I just start hacking. I don't even look. I just close my eyes and just start like waving the knife around. It's the Texas steak knife massacre down at the local playground where I'm just trying to castrate all of the children.
he doesn't like me very much. Here's the clip that was on Twitter. It's very short. Check it out.
Giving kids the puberty blockers after they've been confirmed gender dysphoric and they've consented and their therapists have consented and their doctors have consented and their parents have consented and they've been persistent in gender dysphoria for a minimum of 6 months. Yeah, that's actually a good thing, Matt.
Oh, 6 whole months, you say? Well, we all know that no child would outgrow a phase after 6 months. 6 months is when it's...
Well, it's definitely possible that you could outgrow a phase within 6 months. However, when we're talking about medical diagnosis, persistent gender dysphoria for a duration of 6 months minimum, that's actually pretty significant. I can tell you, as somebody who's had depression, if I had to have just depression for 6 months straight, that would be a fucking nightmare. That would be so terrible. Yeah, if we're talking about persistent gender dysphoria for a minimum of 6 months, that's pretty good. That is consistent discomfort here. This isn't fluctuating as you would expect a phase to fluctuate. Furthermore, we already have data that shows that 5 years after social transition, most trans youth still identify differently. Most trans youth are still transgender 5 years after social transition. American Academy of Pediatrics. The current study examined the rate of retransition and current gender identities of 317 initially transgender youth. Participating in a longitudinal study, we found that an average of 5 years after their initial social transition, 7.3% of youth had retransitioned at least once. At the end of this period, most youth identified as binary transgender youth, 94%, including 1.3% who retransitioned to another identity before returning to their binary transgender identity. A total of 2.5% of youth identified as cisgender and 3.5% as non-binary. The majority of youth studied here over this 5-year time period found that 94% still identified as binary transgender. So 6 months isn't that long. It's not like there is no phase that can ever last longer than 6 months. Ooh. However, considering the fact that most trans people continue to identify as trans, so could it be a phase? Sure, it could be. Is there such a thing as social contagion? Yes, I'm biting all these bullets. I have no problem. The thing is, again, though, is that if there's a social contagion or if it's just a phase, it is up to the gender clinics to be educated enough to snuff out who is genuine in their gender dysphoria and who might just be a victim of social contagion. This is an argument as to why gender clinics need more funding. This is not an argument against transgender people.
It's set in stone. I have no days after 6 months. 6 months is when it's set in stone. I have never seen my own kids be interested in something or go through a phase that lasts 6 whole months. I mean, 6 months, this is their identity now. Might as well chemically castrate them, right? What else?
Again, he keeps on saying chemical castration, so maybe we should just go on over here and read a little bit about how puberty blockers work. Scientific American. AAP and Endocrine Society guidelines call for developmentally appropriate care, and that means no puberty blockers or hormones until young people are already undergoing puberty for their sex assigned at birth. Those guidelines provide the option of puberty blockers, and what these do, they block the release of sex hormones. Once young people are already into the second of 5 puberty stages, these are offered only if a teen is not ready to make decisions about puberty. Access to gender-affirming hormones and potential access to gender-affirming surgery is available at age 16. Again, this would be in dire cases, and ideally you would wait till 18. And then in the case of transmasculine youth, only mastectomy, also known as top surgery. The Endocrine Society does not recommend genital surgery for minors. A 2021 systematic review of 44 peer-reviewed studies found that parent connectedness is associated with greater resilience among teens and young adults who are transgender or gender diverse. So let's see. First, a gender therapist has to diagnose the young person with gender dysphoria. After a gender dysphoria diagnosis, and only if earlier conversations suggest that hormones are indicated, guidelines call for discussion of fertility, puberty suppression, and hormones. Puberty-suppressing medications have been used for decades for cisgender children who start puberty early, but they are not meant to be used indefinitely. The Endocrine Society guidelines recommend a maximum of 2 years on puberty blockers to allow more time for children to form their gender identity before undergoing puberty for their sex assigned at birth, the effects of which are irreversible. So keep in mind that if you're on puberty blockers for like 10 years, yeah, they're going to have some significant detrimental effects. However, they are reversible if you are only on them for 2 years or less. Again, we're back to square one with medication, okay? Too much medication can be bad. The right amount of medication can be good. Going on medication for a certain amount of time can be good. Going on medication for a long period of time can be bad. These are the nuances of medicine. Last but not least, there are, of course, potential side effects that come along with puberty blockers, just as there are potential side effects with any medication. My argument has never been that puberty blockers are 100% completely safe and there's never even been a single reported side effect. Obviously, there are negative side effects that can occur. The question really comes down to, 1, how permanent are these side effects? Most of them don't seem to be. And 2, do the risks outweigh the benefits or vice versa? This also goes into the potential side effects. A 2015 longitudinal observational cohort study found that by the time the participants were 22 years old, trans women experienced a decrease in bone mineral density. This is a potential issue, by the way, bone density. A 2020 study of puberty suppression in gender diverse and transgender young people found that those who started puberty blockers in early puberty had lower mineral bone density before the start of treatment than the public at large. This suggests, the authors wrote, that puberty blocker use may not be the cause of low bone mineral density for these young people. Instead, they found that lack of exercise was a primary factor in low bone mineral density, especially among transgender girls. Here we have the potential side effects, which you would hopefully be aware of before going on this medication. Obviously, you should be educated on all of this. And based on what this study is showing, it potentially can cause a decrease in bone density. However, for one group, it didn't even have any effect on their bone density. Their bone density was already lower because of lack of exercise. So that's just a little bit more information on puberty blockers, what the science actually says on this matter.
In 6 months, this is their identity now. Might as well chemically castrate them, right? What else are we supposed to do? I mean, we could do exactly what we had already been doing for all of human history up until 18 seconds ago. We could just let kids go through their phases, let them grow out of it, instead of locking them in place and turning an awkward moment into a lifelong identity crisis. We could do that.
Well, again, because Matt's vision of this is like little Timmy wanted a girl Happy Meal, so now his parents are rushing him to the clinic to have his dick chopped off. Of course, it seems much better to just let them sort of grow up and sort of discover themselves naturally. Of course, but that's not the alternative. It's not just naturally let them grow into their identity or literally hack their dick off the moment they say they like the color pink. Sometimes it's like, this is my child who is distressed, significantly distressed, depressed, suicidal. They've been this way now for months. What do I do?
But before we get too far in addressing Hunter's points, we should be fair and get the entire context. I had a little bit of a back and forth with him on Twitter yesterday where he fleshed out his argument, such as it is. He explained that children can consent to these, quote, treatments because the parents and doctors also consent. I asked, well, how does the consent of the adults somehow validate the consent of the child? In other words, if a child cannot consent to making permanent life-altering decisions, how does the consent of the adult around the child change that? And
Again, he just doesn't understand medical consent. This is bizarre. Literally any medical treatment for any child requires not only the child's consent, but also the parent's consent or the guardian's consent.
Responded that he's only talking about puberty blockers, not the cross-sex hormones or surgeries. In fact, he clarified that hormones and surgeries should wait until the child turns 18, according to, in his opinion. But puberty blockers are different because they are a life-saving medical intervention, he claimed. He also noted that I am an ape and I should go F myself.
Oh man, that's rich, dude. Holy shit, he's trying so hard. Listen to how mean this soy boy was to me on Twitter.
Now, when I asked how it could ever be appropriate to chemically castrate a child, which is what the puberty blocker does, he answered this, quote, firstly, too much Tylenol can kill you. They aren't death pills. Puberty blockers can be detrimental if given in large doses, but beneficial when given in proper doses. Why is this so hard for your chimp brain to grasp? Medicine can be good. Too much medicine can be bad. He later insisted again, smaller doses of puberty blockers are not chemical castration. I'm fine with puberty blockers for minors. Surgery and hormones shouldn't be given until unless 18 years or older. Go back to being the creepy dude hanging outside the high school, you degenerate scum.
Holy shit. Listen, I love shit talking on Twitter, okay? I love shit talking in general, but it is so rich to hear his syndicated news voice reading my insults back in like this formal manner. He then says that I should go back to being the creepy dude outside the high school.
I had to ask about 3 or 4 times for any evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving, as he claimed. And finally, after furiously Googling for whatever random studies he could find, but certainly not read, he responded, quote, sure,
So before we get into this, this is a very common insult, of course. Hunter's just rapidly Googling for any study that agrees with him. This is bullshit. I have an entire document here, LGBT notes, where you can see that I have compiled my research over years. So no, this isn't me just like furiously Googling till I can find one study that supports my claim. A very bad attempt at a roast, I guess. And it's also not a random study. Like it's actually a pretty significant study.
He responded, quote, sure, I've attached some evidence below. Since you're too retarded to read yourself, firstly, here's a cohort of trans people over 40 plus years showing that no increase of suicide was present after transition. Although the suicide risk remained higher, this was due to social issues, not transition. Secondly, here's a study which found that puberty suppression and affirmation care was correlated with a 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts. So again, go F yourself, you pathetic ape man.
So based. Somebody's got to clip that for a new dono sound, okay?
Now everyone's up to speed. A few points, Hunter. First of all, you appear to be about 13 years old, but as far as I know, you're actually a full-grown man, technically, which means that you should understand by now that a weak argument doesn't become strong just by tacking an insult onto the end of it. Actually, that...
He is completely correct, by the way. A weak argument followed up by an insult does not make the argument any stronger. A decent argument followed up with an insult is usually really fine, though. All of which my arguments were sound refutation of Matt's dumbfuck logic. So me tacking an insult at the end is completely acceptable. Also, I really hope that Matt fucking Walsh is not about to give me a lesson on optics and how I should actually be nicer or something.
That makes your weak argument look even weaker. And it makes you look like a child in the process. And this is a special problem for you since you already look like a child.
Remind me to stay far, far away from Matt Walsh, okay? He's obviously really eyeing me, considering that I apparently look like a child, according to him. I want to stay far away from this guy.
And if you are going to go the insult route, you probably don't want to throw terms like degenerate around. Remember, you're the one in this conversation passionately defending the right of a doctor to give a child the same drug they use to chemically castrate sex offenders.
Why does he keep on saying this? Should I just keep repeating myself? Yes, it's the same drug, but dosages is what matters here. This is like saying, did you know that some people are prescribed 80 milligrams of Adderall a day? Yeah, for narcolepsy, but if we're talking about Adderall for ADHD, it's usually just like 10 milligrams. Dosages matter for the condition you're attempting to treat. This is so simple. What do you guys think, chat? Is Matt Walsh unironically just an ape brain? Or do you think that he's being intentionally obtuse? I think that more than likely he's being intentionally obtuse.
On the anti-child castration side of discussion, you're on the pro side. So you're free to stake out that ground if you want, but you are unfortunately precluded from ever calling anyone else a degenerate ever again in your entire life.
Well, there goes one of my favorite insults. Matt Walsh said I'm not allowed to say it anymore.
Second, I'm afraid that I'm not impressed by the ability to Google a study that confirms whatever conclusion you'd already landed on and then fling it at the other side after briefly skimming the abstract. Okay, it's not how you win an argument. You don't just go to Google, studies that confirm what I already believed. Oh, here's one. See?
They always do this. It's one of the biggest copes, actually. Oh, well, you just Googled a study that agreed with you. Okay, Matt, if everybody can just Google a study to agree with them, where's your study, pal? Where is it? Surely you're going to flash it up on screen for me, right? And the fact that you're just trying to disregard these studies because you used Google or something is embarrassing. Because if that were the case, then you would be able to provide a study that seemingly disproves my study. And you aren't able to do that.
The problem with the study food fight is that two can always play at that game. And in this case, I can play it better.
Please.
I have, for example, the most thorough study ever conducted on this subject, which spanned 30 years and found that suicidality is highest for trans people 10 to 15 years after medical transition. Highest.
He is lying right now. So first and foremost, which study do you think he's talking about there, where he says the best study that tracked trans people over 30 years? It's the Swedish study. So there was a study, a long-term follow-up of transsexuals in Sweden, starting from 1972 until 2003. They followed these transgender individuals, and they did find that sex reassignment surgery was not enough to completely alleviate gender dysphoria. However, the study also concludes that sex reassignment surgery did help. It just isn't like the number one fix-all. And then he goes on to say that suicide is highest 10 to 15 years after transition. I've heard this now a couple times. It's higher 10 years. It's higher 10 years. So I decided to just go and look it up. And sadly, well, not only is Matt misinterpreting this data, the actual data proves him completely wrong. Discussion section. The poorer outcome in the present study might also be explained by longer follow-up period, median 10 years. So this is what they're talking about, where they're following up with them 10 years later. In support of this notion, the survival curve suggests increased mortality from 10 years after sex reassignment and onwards. In accordance, the overall mortality rate was only significantly increased for the group operated before 1989. However, the latter might also be explained by improved healthcare for transsexual persons during the 1990s, along with altered societal attitudes towards persons with different gender expressions. Oh no, Matt. You told me that suicidality was the highest 10 years afterwards. Well, I clicked figure 1 here and it says, what's that say up there? Any cause of death. This isn't suicide. This is total mortality. So not only is he misinterpreting this part of the study, the actual study itself clearly demonstrates that the overall mortality rate was only increased for the group operated before 1989. Afterwards, that didn't happen. So if somebody got an operation in 1990 and then were followed up with in 2000, they would not be at higher risk for suicide because there's now improved healthcare for transsexual persons during the 1990s, along with altered societal attitudes. Just to be very, very crystal clear, okay? This study shows that mortality increased 10 years afterwards, not necessarily suicide. It also showed that mortality only increased for the group operated before 1989. After 1989, there was not this large increase 10 years later because of more positive societal attitudes and better healthcare. So Matt completely misinterpreted this study, as these conservative pricks always fucking do, and the actual study genuinely demonstrates my point.
10 to 15 years after medical transition. Highest. You, on the other hand, have one study that focuses on people who transitioned as adults, not as children, and which, according to you, found that there was no increase in suicide rate. Not that there was a notable decrease, but that there was no increase. And that the suicide rate was still much higher than the general population. Now, you blithely declare that this higher rate of suicide was due to, quote, social issues, not the transition, because you somehow know why all these people killed themselves? How do you know that? Well, you made it up, of course. And whatever the...
Oh no. Didn't he just accuse me of sending him evidence that I didn't read, or sending him studies that I actually didn't read? This is the study he's referencing. Trends in suicide death risk in transgender people results from the Amsterdam cohort of gender dysphoria. First of all, the fact that there was no increase over a 40-year period demonstrates that it's not more likely that trans people are going to kill themselves 10 years later. Literally, this study demolishes your argument beforehand, Matt, where you said, well, they're probably going to commit suicide 10 years later. This is following up with trans people over the course of 40 motherfucking years, and they didn't find an increase in suicide death risk. So that hurts your argument already. Furthermore, oh no, look, if you type in F3 on the study and type in social. Now, it's true that the study did not interview dead people and find out why they themselves personally commit suicide. That is true. However, the study, in the discussion section, gives a very long explanation. Let's go ahead and read this little part. Suicidal behavior is a complex phenomenon that is a result of many individual as well as more distant environmental factors. A recent literature review clearly demonstrates the specific risk factors for suicide in sexual minority youth, which includes negative social environments, inadequate support within the closest social network, and an absence of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movements in communities. Matt's claim was that I didn't read this, that I just am blindly asserting it was due to social reasons. He didn't actually read my study, because my motherfucking study in the discussion section explains that it's most likely because of social reasons. So no, I didn't just make this up. No, I didn't just blindly assume this because this is what's said in my study. And Matt, the fact that you accuse me of not actually reading my evidence, and then you would go on to try and make this kind of an argument, which betrays the fact that you didn't read the study. It's laughable, my friend. The entire world is laughing at the clown show known as Matt Walsh. So no, I did not just make this up. No, I didn't just pull this out of my ass. It was actually in the study. So had Matt actually read the evidence I sent him, he would know not to make such a brain-dead argument. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the ability to read, so he went ahead and made a brain-dead argument. Thank you, Matt. You're giving me easy W's here, okay?
And whatever the reason for the suicides, the fact remains that the suicide rate is still very high. And so that would seem to be a pretty good indication that the transition meant to prevent that outcome failed to prevent it.
Well, no, because the suicide rate is higher, but it also decreases compared to trans youth who, say, wanted puberty suppression but didn't receive it. Compare trans youth who received puberty blockers to trans youth who wanted puberty blockers but didn't receive it. Their depression and likelihood of suicidality decreases. However, they still have a higher on average suicide risk because it's not just treatment is the magic fix-all for everything. There are also external social factors that play a role. This has been demonstrated time and time again. Not only in the study that I literally was just reading, that Matt obviously didn't read, there are countless pieces of literature which demonstrate how when parental involvement is present, when parents are present for their children, their risk of suicide decreases. There are environmental factors here.
And this is the study you provided to prove your point. You know, people are raving about Genucel
Man, this is so embarrassing for you thus far, Matt. Wait, what is this?
skincare. Jessica from Huntsville, Alabama says, my skin looks so soft and clear. I've seen a reduced number of fine lines and dark spots. I have found a new lifetime product. Absolutely love it. Genucel Skincare uses a one-of-a-kind proprietary flower base developed.
Homeboy's putting a sponsor on my video? Now I just feel like I'm being pushed aside, Matt. Hey, tell me, buddy, have there been any longitudinal studies following up with people after like 70,000 years to make sure that this doesn't have any long-term negative effects, Matt?
Right here, this is my own Genucel skincare collection. I collect them. You know.
Yeah, this does seem a little feminine. God damn, Matt. Is there something you're not telling us? Have you been dabbling in the degeneracy a little too much, buddy boy?
I'm a big user by Genucel skincare. The products work to both men, as I'm always telling you. Try Genucel's already fall in love with the results. .com/WalshYT. Genucel.com. WalshYT. You also give another study which claims these findings, and I'm reading now. Quote, in this prospective cohort of 104 trans and non-binary youths aged 13 to 20 years, receipt of gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones, was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality. Okay, well, at least this one pretends to actually prove your point rather than directly refuting it like the other one. But
how did the other one directly refute my argument? The fact that there was no increase in suicidality is all I needed to demonstrate. It stayed neutral. That's proving my point, and it also demolishes your argument, Matt, that after 10 years, their risk of suicide goes up.
You know anything else about this study? Like who funded it? How was it conducted? How did they find their study subjects? How did the researchers guard against things like selection bias? Did they rely entirely on self-reported data? Do you understand how infamously unreliable self-reported data is? How do they quantify suicidal?
It's true that self-reported data is definitely not the most ideal form of data collection. However, self-reported data is one, absolutely better than nothing. And two, for some of these issues, like how many suicidal thoughts have you had since transition? I don't know how you would go about collecting that other than some form of self-report. Even if it was psychologists analyzing individuals and then reporting that they had decreases in suicidality, they would only know that because the individual would be reporting it. So it's true that self-reported data is not ideal. However, it's also wrong to just like ignore self-reported data entirely.
Thoughts? Do you understand how infamously unreliable self-reported data is? How do they quantify suicidal thoughts? A 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts. How do you quantify that to begin with? Of course, you haven't considered any of this, but it doesn't really.
There's qualitative research and then there's quantitative research. Quantitative refers to empiricism, numbers. Qualitative data is also incredibly important because there are some things that we want to study that are not quantitative. So for example, whether or not somebody's having suicidal thoughts, you would first talk to them, which is qualitative data collection, and then you would quantify it from there to get a number, to get the 73% decrease statistic.
How do you quantify that to begin with? Of course, you haven't considered any of this, but it doesn't really matter because there's a fatal problem here. Well, there's a lot, but let's just focus on one. And it's the same one shared by nearly every study claiming to prove that gender-affirming care has positive results. The problem is this, and you would know this if you read the thing that you Googled, which next time you should think about doing that. The results are based.
Why don't you take your own advice, Matt, before you accuse me of making stuff up about a study where it's actually said verbatim in the study what I said?
Based on a 12-month follow-up. Okay, they report that these kids, 12 months after beginning the transition, say that they feel better. You know what that tells us? You know what it proves? Absolutely nothing. Not one single thing. I am not.
They were already on it for 6 months, and then they followed them for an additional 6 months. That was 12-month follow-up. That's a full year. How does that mean nothing, Matt? Is this just you arbitrarily deciding that this doesn't work because it makes you uncomfy?
Not one single thing. I am not surprised that kids who have been told that transition will solve their problems would then report shortly afterwards that it has indeed solved their problems. If you gave a
shortly afterwards, if you were like, I've received 3 injections thus far and I'm way happier, then maybe you would have a point. 12 months? That's a decent time span to be following up on people. The fact that you would just arbitrarily decide that 12 months isn't good enough is very apparent that you do not have evidence on your side. See, rather than providing counter evidence, as I've been doing, Matt, his only thing he can do is try and poke holes and cast doubt on the data that I have otherwise provided. So 12-month follow-up, there's nothing wrong with that at all. And then second of all, I know for you, Matt, since you believe in this crazy conspiracy that like the trans Hitlers are massacring 6 million kids to the transgender ideology every day. I know that since you believe that's happening, I'm sure the fact that they're happier kind of fits in with your conspiracy theory, like what you just said. I'm not surprised that they would be happier after getting the treatment that they were told is going to make them all happy. Like, no one's being told, like, this is going to make you happy. This is your injection of happiness. The minute you get this puberty blocker injected into your fucking leg, you are going to feel euphoric. Like, no one's saying this. They're having real complicated conversations with adolescents, their doctors, their parents, about the potential side effects. So no, it's not like they were told this is going to make them happier, so now they're happier. This is, they're aware of the potential risks. They went on puberty blockers. Over the course of 1 year, there was a 73% decrease in suicidal ideation. This proves my argument, Matt. It disproves your argument. And the fact that you are just arbitrarily deciding 12 months isn't good enough, again, demonstrates you have no arguments.
If you gave a 13-year-old a really ugly tattoo, it's pretty certain that he'd still think it was cool when he's 14. And if the 13-year-old gets a tattoo and then at 14 says, I still like this tattoo, it would be very stupid for you as an adult to say, well, look, see, it turns out getting the tattoo was a good idea. He's 14 and he's...
So remember, Matt, a minute ago, you were shitting on self-reported data, but the only way that we would go about finding out if this hypothetical child was still happy with their tattoo would be self-reported data collection. So in some cases, specifically in issues involving mental health and suicidality, etc., self-reported data is one of the only options we have. So Matt, maybe you're not content then with that study. Maybe I can give you a different one. What about this one, pal? This did use a cross-sectional survey of 20,000 transgender adults, aged 18 to 36 years. They examined self-reported history of pubertal suppression during adolescence. Again, this is not ideal data collection. However, it is absolutely far superior than no data / an uncomfortable tummy ache like what Matt Walsh has. So they used a cross-sectional survey. Here's what they found. There is a significant inverse association between treatment with pubertal suppression during adolescence and lifetime suicidal ideation among transgender adults who ever wanted this treatment. So let's be very clear, Matt. There's not just one study that showed after a year they had a massive decrease in suicidal ideation. There's another study here that talks to transgender adults, and they found that the trans adults who had access to puberty blockers when they were younger had less suicidal ideation as an adult. This is further demonstrating my point when I say they are, quote, life-saving. This is something that is benefiting trans people down the line as well. And that is what this study here indicates.
So the question is not how the 13-year-old feels at 14. The question is, how will he feel 5 years from now, 10 years, 20 years? How does the adult version of the same child feel now that he has to live with the consequences of this?
How does the adult version of that kid feel? Oh man, well, good thing I have this study that I literally just read to you that shows there is a significant inverse association between treatment with pubertal suppression during adolescence and lifetime suicidal ideation among transgender adults. There is a study that exists already like that, and it proves you wrong.
Regret is not likely to set in within the first year, though it very well might. Usually it takes longer, and you'll notice that many of these studies, they stop doing the follow-ups with the patients at precisely the moment when the regret might really start setting in.
See, this is the thing, is why did he read my study prior and say that it proved me wrong? And now he's ignoring the study that I sent him. He's ignoring the study he read prior because that study demolishes the arguments he's making right now. And then, yeah, he goes on to say like, oh, well, what about regret rates? And they never follow up with trans people for longer amounts of time. Well, what about the study that followed up with trans people over 40 motherfucking years and found no increase of suicidality? What about that one, Matt? You know, the study that I previously sent you that you just conveniently ignored because you didn't bother to read it? You know that one, buddy?
Might really start setting in. What we need are long-term follow-ups with people who transitioned as children. But as I'm constantly having to explain, there aren't any reliable studies like that because we just started doing this to children on this scale very recently. So these kids are the test case. They are the guinea pigs. But anyway, you never answered my question. I asked for evidence that puberty blockers are life-saving. You shouldn't need a survey to tell me that. It should be a relatively easy thing to quantify. There was no such thing as a puberty blocker until recently. And if these blockers are life-saving medications, then that would mean that billions of children lived at a time historically when the life-saving medication was not available to them. And that would mean that a great...
Again, he's not understanding math here. Transgender youth who go on to commit suicide is a minority of a minority of a minority of a minority. You're not going to see just raw numbers showing an uptick in suicidality in some years. I mean, you might, but you can't attribute that to lack of puberty blockers. This is disingenuous of him to ask for data like this because trans youth who commit suicide are a tiny, tiny minority. So even if you did have youth who were committing suicide because they couldn't get puberty blockers, you're not going to see that borne out in just raw numbers. Also, do we know they were trans? Back in like the 40s and 50s, I don't think people were being very out and open about the fact that they were trans. So how would that data have even been collected at the time? This is just a disingenuous question. This isn't how numbers work, buddy.
Great many children died because they didn't have access to it. Okay, then, give me some examples. Who died?
Again, I don't know how this data would have been collected because I don't know if the knowledge that they were trans would even be present at the time for that data collection to take place. Second of all, there probably were people that committed suicide because they didn't have treatment, but they didn't know that puberty blockers were even a thing because they weren't a thing at the time. Do you think that people ever committed suicide when they had depression before antidepressants were a thing? Of course. Did people die from cancer before chemotherapy was a thing? Yeah, of course. This doesn't prove anything, Matt. This is such a desperate reach.
Due to a lack of access to this life-saving drug. You're saying it's life-saving. That should mean that many, many children have died because they didn't have access to it. So can you give me some examples? How many children died because there were no puberty blockers available? We should be able to see in history this enormous wave of child deaths due to a lack of chemical castration. Do we? I mean, I could quite easily point to deaths that...
What? Did he forget that like trans youth are an incredibly small minority? I think he just forgot.
Happened because penicillin hadn't been invented yet, for example. So where are the historical deaths that we can pin on a lack of puberty blockers? Now, it is interesting, though, that you can't bring yourself to endorse cross-sex hormones and surgeries for minors. At first blush, this would seem to make you slightly more reasonable than the other child sexual mutilation advocates. But upon further evaluation, it actually makes your position even more incoherent, if that's possible. After all, the very medical establishment that you trust implicitly when it comes to puberty blockers also says that hormones and surgeries can be life-saving medical interventions for children. So why do you trust them on the blockers?
Usually, again, it's like the youngest would be 16, and that wouldn't even be for genital reassignment surgery. But like, why do I trust them? Like, again, I think it's probably possible that if somebody's at the age of 16, and again, they are in dire need of some kind of intervention because their depression and gender dysphoria is so bad, like, yeah, then maybe it would be acceptable. But I know in my personal opinion, I don't think that you should go for something that's that significant when you're under the age of 18. This is like a difference of opinion on the age in which you can begin treatment. This isn't me saying I don't trust the medical institution, but I also trust the medical institutions.
But not on the hormones and surgeries. If they're lying, or let's be very generous, catastrophically mistaken about the latter two, doesn't it stand to reason that the same would apply to the first? Blockers, hormone surgeries, they're all part of the same process of medical, quote, affirmation. What you're saying is that you agree with step 1, but you think they're wrong about steps 2 and 3.
No, because I think that they're correct in the sense that gender transition surgery can also be incredibly beneficial, and all available data we have on that subject also demonstrates that trans people fare much better after gender transition surgery. So no, I'm completely fine with that. I agree with their guidelines as far as gender transition. I just disagree with the age in which you could begin, the earliest age in which you could begin that treatment. Ideally, you would wait until the age of 18. This is just the smart thing to do. However, the guidelines exist for dire circumstances, not just the ideal.
This might not be an insurmountable logical problem for you, except that the only reason you agree with step 1 is simply because you're taking their word for it. They claim that puberty blockers save lives, and you believe them. Well, why don't you believe the rest of the story they tell? And if you don't, then have you considered that your skepticism should be more consistently applied? Third,
I don't even trust them at all. I only trust the bits and pieces that confirm my feelings. Let's go ahead and pull up another hilarious bit of irony here. So keep in mind that the youngest age in which you could begin hormones or get like a mastectomy would be the age of 16. I think that's too young. I think you should wait till 18. Now, Matt's position here is this is happening to children. They're having the hormones, mutilation think of the poor kids. I thought that Matt said that a 16-year-old was an adult. So now I'm just completely confused. Let's go and pull up the clip. Okay, so this is Matt Walsh in 2011. Keep in mind what he's accusing me of is being in favor of mutilating children. We're talking about 16-year-olds here, Matt. What did you have to say about 16-year-olds again?
What I'm saying, though, is that if society was if society was different and that we stopped insisting that you're a kid until you're 25 and we just deal with the reality that at about 16 you're an adult who is mature and can make decisions. You are that at 16. I don't care what anybody says.
Okay. Well, that's what Matt Walsh had to say anyway. Why do you think, Matt, that 16-year-olds can consent to sex, marriage, child rearing, but they're just poor, helpless little babies when it comes to gender identity? Very curious, Matt. Very strange. Very sad that you're over here acting as if I'm the one that's going after children, but you don't even think 16-year-olds are children. You're just a fucking creepy loser.
Third, finally, have you thought about just using your common sense? Has that thought occurred to you? You tried to rely on studies. That blew up in your face. You want to appeal to...
That blew up in my face, guys. Wow. Listen, anytime somebody invokes common sense, they've lost the argument. I don't care. Anytime you invoke common sense, you've lost the argument. Because common sense, one, is entirely subjective. And two, it's based only on personal experience. So again, I've brought up this example before, but like, if you take somebody who grew up in the jungle, common sense for them is probably run to the tree as fast as possible. They don't know what a car is. They don't know where to look. They don't know they're supposed to look both ways before crossing the street because that's not their common sense. Their common sense is get to the tree so that you don't get eaten by a lion or something. Common sense varies significantly from person to person, region to region. The fact that he would be like, just use your common sense, my lad, when common sense is nothing but arbitrary and subjective. Meanwhile, this dude shits on self-reported data. Meanwhile, this dude shits on qualitative research. You realize reported data, self-reports, qualitative research, that's all subjective, right? Common sense is also subjective. So the fact that you would say use your common sense when common sense is different for virtually every single human being, again, is embarrassing. And lastly, no, common sense is supposed to refer to a basic bare minimum level of sense. Okay? Don't run in front of that moving truck. That's my common sense. Common sense does not tell you anything about the nuances regarding complex treatments for gender dysphoria, transgender youth, etc.
You want to appeal to authority, except that even you can't figure out whether you should trust these authorities or not. You're all kinds of confused. You don't know which way is up, which way is down. Maybe consider applying your own mental faculties to this situation. Here's a very simple question. Does it make sense to you? Does it actually make sense that a young boy might, in some sense, be a girl somehow, necessitating the use of chemical castration drugs to suppress some of the physical effects of male puberty? Does that proposition make sense?
Yes. When you're familiar with how the external social construct of gender informs the internal identity of oneself in regards to gender, actually, yeah, it makes complete sense to me. 100%, yes. And then, of course, you try and poison the well by jumping in there and saying, the chemical castration drugs, the puberty blockers, which do not chemically castrate anybody so long as they're given in proper dosages, are just one option to put a pause on things, to give yourself more time to figure stuff out.
Does it make sense to take a boy who is male and try to alter him in some way in an effort to make him into, or make it appear as though he has been made into, something he can never be?
No, you should not do that. You shouldn't just take somebody and try to like make them into something else. No, you shouldn't do that. Don't do that, okay? Just like you shouldn't take somebody who's trans and try to make them straight or make them cis. You shouldn't take somebody who's cis and try to make them trans. It's far more about facilitating a free environment in which these people can grow into their identities naturally, and you as the parent or the guardian provide safe boundaries and guidelines. Well, that's the end of the video, guys, and I have been canceled. Hunter Avabalani, there is no coming back from this one. After Matt Walsh misinterpreted everything I said, lied about studies, ignored reading studies, and then accused me of not reading the study, even though he was the one who didn't read the study. Apparently, I'm the one who's canceled. I am never coming back from this. Hunter Avalan's career, dead. It's in flames right now. I can smell the smoke. I also have a couple other studies that I want to take a look at as well. There are no large-scale studies examining mental health among transgender and non-binary youth who receive gender-affirming hormone therapy. Okay, data were collected as part of a 2020 survey. Adjusted logistic regression assessed whether receipt of puberty blockers was associated with lower levels of depression, thoughts of suicide, and attempted suicide among those who wanted the treatment. Use of puberty blockers was associated with lower odds of recent depression and seriously considering suicide compared to those who wanted the treatment but did not receive it. For youth under age 18, puberty blockers was associated with lower odds of recent depression and of a past year suicide attempt. This is just one study which found that puberty blockers again was associated with lower likelihood of depression, suicidality, etc. This is another really interesting study that was published in 2020, reduction in mental health treatment among transgender individuals after gender-affirming surgeries. So this is not for children, this one. This is just about the overall benefit that can occur from this treatment. So this study used the Swedish Total Population Register, which was nearly 10 million people, links to the National Patient Register and the Prescribed Drug Register among individuals who received a diagnosis of gender incongruence between 2005 and 2015. So compared with the general population, individuals with gender incongruence diagnosis were about 6 times as likely to have a mood and anxiety disorder, etc., etc. We already know that they're at higher risks, of course. Now, this is really interesting. Years since initiating hormone treatment was not significantly related to likelihood of mental health treatment. However, increased time since last gender-affirming surgery was associated with reduced mental health treatment, meaning they were no longer needing mental health treatment once they looked at longer time between the gender-affirming surgery and where that individual was currently. So just a few other studies here that further demonstrate and elucidate my point. There you guys have it. This is Matt Walsh calling me out and failing really, really miserably. Matt Walsh simps, who unfortunately are a result of inbreeding. Their general consensus, of course, is like, Hunter got wrecked. Hoo hoo hee hee ha ha. But at the end of the day, no, I didn't. Matt Walsh misinterpreted what I said, didn't read the studies. He accused me of not reading the studies when he was the one who actually didn't read them. He told me to use common sense. He tried to ignore data that was inconvenient for him, and then he forgot how numbers work. Anybody who thinks that this is me getting demolished or canceled, seek help. Seek help immediately. I'm sorry that your stepfather beat you as severely as he did. It's not too late to seek treatment. But there you guys have it. Matt Walsh apparently canceling me and failing miserably. I would love to debate Matt Walsh.